The shot echoed across the valley like a death sentence. But Silas Ward wasn't aiming at what he hit. He stood frozen, his rifle still smoking, his hands trembling as he stared at the small figure crumpled behind the boulder. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, wearing clothes that didn't belong to any ranch around these parts. An Apache child, this far from tribal lands, moving like a shadow between the rocks at dawn. It made no sense. For 3 hours, Silas had been tracking what he thought was a wounded deer. The blood trail led him here, to this cluster of red stones where the morning mist still clung like ghostly fingers. He'd seen a flash of movement, raised the rifle, and fired at what should have been his prey. Instead, he'd shot a boy. The child wasn't moving. Blood was pooling beneath his small frame, dark and stark against the pale dirt. But there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. The boy's hands were bound with rope, and the marks on his wrists were days old, raw, and angry. Someone had been holding this child captive. But who? And why was he here, in the middle of nowhere, tied up and running for his life? Silas knelt beside the motionless figure, his mind a whirlwind of questions with no answers. The boy's breathing was shallow, but it was there. He was alive, barely. That's when he heard them. Hoofbeats, approaching fast from the east, multiple riders, moving with a purpose that felt like a coming storm, and they were heading straight for this place. The boy's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, meeting Silas's gaze with a look of pure, animal terror. His lips moved, forming a single desperate word in broken English. Hide. Then his eyes rolled back into his head, and he went limp again. The hoofbeats were getting closer, pounding like a war drum against the earth. Silas could hear voices now, rough, angry voices calling out words he couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. They were hunting. They were hunting for this boy. Whatever had brought this Apache child to this remote valley, bleeding and bound, it wasn't over. And now, Silas was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. But what he decided to do in that split second would change not only his life, but the fate of everyone in that valley. The decision came to him in the heartbeat before the riders crested the hill. He couldn't leave the boy. He couldn't let them find him like this, wounded and defenseless. Without another thought, Silas scooped the boy into his arms, surprised by how light the child felt, like a bundle of sticks. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder, and fresh blood seeped through his torn shirt from where the bullet had grazed his side. It wasn't a fatal wound, but it needed attention, and it needed it fast. The voices grew louder, harsh, and demanding. Through the thinning morning mist, Silas caught sight of them. 3 men on horseback, their faces weathered and cruel, etched with the kind of hardness that comes from a life lived on the wrong side of the law. These weren't Apache. Their clothes, their saddles, their rifles all marked them as drifters. "Where'd that little rat go?" one of them shouted, his voice carrying across the rocks like a curse. "He can't have gone far with them ropes on." Silas pressed himself and the boy tight against the cold stone of the boulder, holding his breath, praying the child would stay silent. But the boy in his arms stirred weakly, letting out a soft, pained moan that seemed to echo as loud as thunder in the morning stillness. One of the horses snorted, its rider pulling up short, his head cocked. "You hear something?" he asked his companions. "Just keep looking," the leader grunted. "Boss ain't gonna be happy if we come back empty-handed again." The riders spread out, their horses' hooves clicking and scraping against the stone as they began a systematic search of the area. Silas could hear them getting closer, their voices a low, menacing rumble. He knew his hiding spot wouldn't last. The boy needed a doctor, and these men clearly meant him a world of harm. That's when he made the choice that would set everything in motion. Instead of staying hidden, instead of waiting to be found, Silas stood up. He stood up, still carrying the unconscious Apache boy, and walked directly toward his own horse, which was tied near the creek. He moved with a deliberate purpose, as if he belonged there, as if carrying a wounded, bound Apache boy was the most natural thing in the world. "Hey!" one of the riders called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. "You there!" Silas turned calmly, shifting the boy's weight in his arms. "Morning," he said, his own voice steady, betraying none of the frantic pounding of his heart. The three men rode over, their horses circling him like vultures. The leader, a grizzled man with a jagged scar running down his left cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "You seen a boy come through here? Apache kid, about this tall?" He held his hand out at chest height. "Can't say that I have," Silas replied, looking the man straight in the eye, forcing himself not to glance down at the boy in his arms. "Been out huntin' since dawn." He then gestured to the child, a flicker of defiance in his gaze. "Only thing I've seen is this." The scarred man's eyes narrowed, his gaze dropping to the unconscious child. He studied the boy's face for a long, tense moment. "That's him," he said slowly, a grim smile spreading across his lips. "That's our boy." "Your boy?" Silas asked, his grip tightening protectively around the child, whose name he still didn't know. "Belongs to us," another rider snarled, his hand drifting towards the rifle in its scabbard. "Hand him over." But Silas was already backing away, moving slowly toward his horse, his mind racing faster than it ever had before. These men hadn't just been holding the boy captive. That much was clear from their words and the raw rope marks on his wrists. Whatever they wanted him for, it was something terrible. "I don't think so," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. The scarred man's hand moved from his saddle horn to the butt of his pistol. "Son," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that no one, least of all Silas, could ever have predicted. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. 3 hardened men against a young rancher with 1 good shot and a wounded boy in his arms. But sometimes, desperation can make a coward into a hero, and Silas Ward was no coward. He was just a man who had stumbled into a nightmare. "This boy's been shot," Silas said, his voice carrying across the still morning air, a statement of fact that was also a challenge. "He needs medical attention, not whatever you men had planned for him." The scarred leader let out a harsh laugh, a sound like gravel scraping against metal. "What we got planned ain't your concern, boy," he sneered. "That little Apache is worth good money to the right people." Money. The word hit Silas like a physical blow. They weren't just holding him captive, they were selling him. The rope marks, the terror in the boy's eyes, the desperate, doomed attempt to escape through the wilderness. It all made a horrible, sickening kind of sense now. "Over my dead body," Silas said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "That can be arranged," the second rider said, pulling his rifle from its scabbard and cocking the hammer. The sound was deafening in the quiet of the valley. But Silas had one advantage they didn't expect. He knew this land better than he knew his own face. Every rock, every ravine, every creek bed was carved into his memory from a lifetime of hunting and herding cattle. The creek behind him led to a narrow, twisting canyon that would force them to come at him single file if he could just get there. "You boys might want to think this through," Silas said, still backing slowly toward the water's edge. "This is Ward land you're on. My family's been here 20 years. Neighbors tend to notice when strangers come calling." It was a complete bluff. His closest neighbor was miles away. But it worked. The scarred man's iron confidence wavered, just for a second. The Ward name carried weight in these parts. Reputation was everything in the territories. "Don't matter whose land this is," the leader said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Business is business." Just then, the boy in Silas's arms stirred again, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at his unlikely rescuer with a daze of confusion, then past him at the 3 riders. Raw fear flooded his young face, and he tried to speak, but only a dry whisper came out. "It's all right," Silas murmured to him, a promise he had no idea how to keep. "You're safe now." But they weren't safe. Not yet. The riders were spreading out again, their brief hesitation gone, trying to flank him, to cut off his escape. In moments, they'd have him surrounded with nowhere left to run. That's when Silas heard it. The sound he'd been bluffing about, the sound he'd been praying for, hoofbeats, coming fast from the east, multiple riders, and these ones, he recognized. "Silas!" The voice belonged to his neighbor, Marcus Holloway, and he wasn't alone. 3 riders topped the ridge, their rifles ready, drawn by the sound of voices carrying across the valley. The odds had just changed. The scarred man cursed under his breath, his face twisting in frustration as he realized his advantage had evaporated in an instant. "This ain't over," he snarled at Silas, his eyes burning with a hateful promise. "That boy belongs to us." "Not anymore, he doesn't," Marcus called out, his rifle trained squarely on the stranger's chest. The 3 men exchanged venomous glances, weighing their options. It was 3 against 4 now, and they were on foreign ground, facing armed neighbors who clearly knew each other well. "We'll be back for what's ours," the leader spat, wheeling his horse around with a violent jerk. As the strangers rode away, disappearing back into the mist, Silas felt the boy's small hand grip his shirt. The child was trying to tell him something, his lips forming words that barely made a sound. But what that child was trying to warn him about would prove to be far more dangerous than any 3 armed men. Back at the Ward Ranch, Silas's mother, Martha, took one look at the wounded boy in her son's arms and asked no questions. She was a woman carved from the same tough earth as the ranch itself. She simply pointed to the big kitchen table and began gathering supplies. "Hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey," she ordered, her hands already gently examining the boy's wound. "Bullet just grazed him, but it needs cleaning proper." Marcus Holloway and his men had followed them back, their faces still grim, still wary of the strangers who might decide to return. "Silas," Marcus said quietly, pulling him aside while Martha worked. "You know what you've done here? Taking in an Apache boy? Folks around here ain't gonna like it." "I know exactly what I've done, Marcus," Silas replied, his gaze fixed on his mother's steady hands. "And I'd do it again." But as Martha cleaned the boy's wound, she discovered something that changed everything. Hidden beneath the boy's torn shirt, pressed against his skin by a leather thong, was a small, grimy pouch. Inside were 3 heavy gold coins and a folded, sweat-stained piece of paper. Silas carefully unfolded the document, his face growing pale as he read the cramped, spidery script. It was a bill of sale. A bill of sale, written in English, describing the boy, identified only as Apache male, age approx 12, as property sold to a man named Garrett Wells for the sum of $50. "They weren't just holding him," Silas said, his voice tight with a cold, rising anger. "They bought him. Someone sold this boy like he was livestock." Martha's hands stilled. She'd seen enough cruelty in her 45 years on the frontier to last a lifetime, but this was different. This was a child, no older than her own nephew back east. At that moment, the boy's eyes opened, focusing on the faces gathered around him. When he saw the paper in Silas's hands, a wave of panic washed over his features. He tried to sit up, his voice a frantic whisper of broken English. "No. Go back. Please, no, go back." "You're not going anywhere," Silas said firmly, trying to soothe him. "You're safe here." But the boy shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the men who had been chasing him. "Not safe," he insisted. "They come, many men. Come for Takakota." "How many men?" Marcus asked, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle propped against the wall. The boy, Takakota, held up both his hands, fingers splayed, then held them up again, and then added 3 more fingers. 23. The number hit the room like a cold wind. 23, Martha breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Sweet mercy! What kind of an operation are they running? Takakota struggled to explain, his limited English mixing with Apache words they couldn't possibly understand. But gradually, through gestures and simple, repeated phrases, a horrifying picture began to emerge. There was a camp, he told them, hidden deep in the canyons, a 2-day ride north. Children were kept there, dozens of them, Apache, Mexican, taken from their families and sold to buyers who came from distant unknown territories. How long were you there? Silas asked gently. Takakota held up 7 fingers, then made a small circle with his hand, mimicking the moon. 7 months. For 7 agonizing months, this 12-year-old boy had been held captive, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder, treated like an animal. Marcus stood up abruptly, his face a mask of grim determination. We need to get word to the territorial marshal. This is bigger than any of us can handle. But Takakota grabbed Silas's arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so small and weak. No lawman, he said, his voice urgent, desperate. Lawman. Help bad men. Lawman take money too. The corruption ran deeper than they could have imagined. If the boy was right, then going to the authorities wouldn't just be useless. It could be a death sentence. The lawmen and the slavers were one and the same. Then what do we do? Martha asked, her voice trembling slightly. Silas looked down at Takakota, seeing not just a wounded child, but a survivor. A boy who had endured 7 months of unimaginable hell and still found the strength to run. The boy had trusted him enough to speak, to reveal the terrible truth about his captors. He couldn't let him down now. We take him home, Silas said quietly, the decision settling in his heart with the weight of stone. Home? Marcus asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. To his people, Silas clarified, to his family. But what Silas didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that taking Takakota home would require him to do something no white man had ever attempted in these parts. And it would start a war he wasn't prepared to fight. The Apache territory began 20 miles north of the Ward Ranch, an invisible line marked not by fences or posts, but by a tense, unspoken understanding that had kept a fragile peace for 3 long years. White settlers stayed south, the Apache stayed north, and the few meetings between the 2 groups were handled through careful, cautious negotiation. Silas had never crossed that line. No Ward ever had. But as he prepared for the journey, loading supplies onto his horse while Takakota rested inside, he knew he had no other choice. The boy needed to get home, and after 7 months of captivity, he deserved to see his family again. You're making a colossal mistake, Silas, Marcus warned him, leaning against the corral fence, his arms crossed. The Apache don't distinguish between good white men and bad ones. They'll see your face, and they'll assume you're part of whatever happened to that boy. They might kill you before you get a word out. Martha emerged from the house, her face etched with worry. She carried a bundle of food and medical supplies. His fever broke this morning, she reported, her voice strained. He's weak, but he's stable enough to travel. Just then, Takakota appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but under his own power. Martha had found him some of her late husband's old clothes, cut down to fit his small frame. He looked like any other frontier boy now, except for the weariness in his dark eyes, a shadow that spoke of experiences no child should ever have to endure. You don't have to come with me, Silas told him gently. I can take you to your people's lands and explain what happened. Takakota shook his head, his determination clear. Takakota, go, he said. Must tell father. About other children. Other children. The words hit Silas like a punch to the gut. He had almost forgotten. There were more kids in that hidden camp, 22 of them, still waiting to be sold, still suffering. By bringing Takakota home, they weren't just returning a lost son. They might be able to organize a rescue. The ride north, took them through terrain that grew more rugged and unforgiving with each passing mile. Takakota, despite his young age and his ordeal, proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out safe paths and hidden water sources that Silas, for all his knowledge of his own lands, never would have found alone. As they traveled, the boy began to open up, his trust in Silas growing with every mile they covered. His father, Nalish, was a respected leader, a war chief who had been searching relentlessly for his son since the day he disappeared. Takakota had been taken while hunting rabbits near the river, grabbed from behind by men who specialized in capturing children from isolated areas where their cries for help would go unheard. "Why, children?" Silas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Easier to break," Takakota said, his voice matter-of-fact, chillingly calm. "Easier to make forget family, sell far away. No one come looking." The casual, practiced way the boy spoke about it made Silas's stomach turn. This wasn't just a single, monstrous act. It was a business. A well-organized, brutal business built on the suffering of children. By late afternoon, they had reached the edge of Apache lands. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, watchful. Takakota grew more alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of his people. Soon, they saw it, a thin plume of smoke from cooking fires rising in the distance. Silas felt his nerves tighten into a cold knot in his stomach. "They see us," Takakota said simply. Silas looked around, squinting into the rocks and scrub brush, but saw nothing. Then a movement caught his eye, a flicker, and another. Figures were emerging from behind rocks and trees, appearing as if from nowhere, materializing out of the very landscape itself. Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, surrounding their position with a practiced, silent stealth that was both beautiful and terrifying. One of them stepped forward. He was a tall man, his hair streaked with gray, his face a map of old scars that spoke of 100 battles. When he saw Takakota, his stern, impassive expression cracked, and a single name escaped his lips, a broken whisper. "Father," Takakota called out, sliding down from the horse and running toward the man. The reunion was everything Silas had hoped for and more. A father embracing his lost son, tears of disbelief and overwhelming relief streaming down his weathered face. But as the man, Nalish, looked up at the white man who had brought his boy home, Silas saw something in those dark eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't gratitude. It was raw, burning suspicion and something else that looked dangerously, terrifyingly like rage. The other warriors had their weapons ready, bows drawn, lances held firm. And Silas realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that he might have just made the biggest and last mistake of his life. Nalish spoke rapidly in Apache to his warriors, his voice sharp and carrying the unmistakable authority of a leader making critical, life-or-death decisions. Silas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were discussing what to do with him, the white man who had appeared from nowhere with the chief's long-lost son, a son who was wounded. "Father, no!" Takakota said in English, stepping bravely between the warriors and Silas. "This man, he saved Takakota. He, good man." "White men took you," Nalish replied in careful, measured English, his piercing eyes never leaving Silas's face. "A white man brings you back. Why should I trust any of your people?" The logic was painful, but it was undeniable. From Nalish's perspective, white settlers had kidnapped his son and held him for 7 agonizing months. Now, another white man appears, claiming to be a rescuer. It could easily be a trick, a trap. Silas slowly, carefully dismounted, keeping his hands open and visible, far away from his weapons. "I understand your suspicion," he said, his voice calm despite the fear coiling in his gut. "If someone took my boy, I'd feel the same way." "You have no boy," Nalish observed flatly. "No," Silas admitted. But I have a mother who would die if I disappeared, just like you nearly died when Takakota was taken. Something flickered in the Apache leader's eyes. Not trust, not yet, but a glimmer of recognition, the universal pain of a parent's love. Takakota pulled the folded, crumpled paper from his pocket, the bill of sale that had named him as property. He handed it to his father and began speaking rapidly in his own tongue, gesturing toward Silas, then back toward the south, recounting the entire ordeal. As Nalish read the English words on the document, his expression darkened from suspicion into a thunderous rage. He looked at his son's healing wound, then back at Silas, with a dawning new understanding. My son says you shot him, Nalish said finally, the words an accusation. By accident, Silas admitted, not flinching from the truth. I was hunting. I thought he was a deer. When I realized what I'd done, I couldn't let those men take him back. Those men, the ones who were chasing him. They said he belonged to them. Said they'd paid good money for him. Nalish crumpled the paper in his powerful fist, pure hatred building in his features. 23 children, he said, his voice a low growl. My son tells me there are 22 other children stolen from their families. We have to stop them, Silas said, stepping forward. We? Nalish's voice carried a sharp, cynical edge. You'll need someone who knows their territory, Silas pressed on, his idea forming even as he spoke. Someone they won't suspect, someone they think is just another settler looking to do business. The Apache leader studied him for a long, silent moment. Around them, the warriors waited for his command, their weapons still ready, but no longer pointed directly at Silas's heart. Why would you risk this? Nalish asked, the question genuine. These are not your people's children. Silas thought about Takakota's small hand, gripping his shirt in the darkness of the ranch house. The absolute terror in the boy's eyes. The casual, monstrous way those men had spoken about selling a human child. Any child suffering is my concern, he said simply. Takakota spoke again in Apache, his young voice earnest and persuasive, his words carrying a weight that belied his years. Whatever he was saying, it seemed to be working. Finally, with a slow, reluctant nod, Nalish seemed to reach a decision. My son says you cared for his wound as family would, he said, translating the boy's plea. That you fed him from your own table and risked your own life to bring him home. He paused, his gaze intense. This is not the action of an enemy. Then you'll trust me? Silas asked, a sliver of hope rising within him. I will use you, Nalish corrected him sternly. There is a difference. But as he spoke, Silas saw something else in the Apache leader's eyes, hidden deep beneath the layers of grief and anger. It was a glimmer of respect, something that hadn't been there before. Tell me about this camp, Nalish said, his voice all business now. Tell me everything my son remembers, and then we will plan how to bring our children home. What neither of them knew, what no one in that small, tense circle could have known, was that their entire conversation was being watched. From a distant, sun-baked ridge, a man with a spyglass had seen it all. The watcher on the ridge was one of Garrett Wells's men, the very man who had followed the riders back after their confrontation with Silas, sent to track the escaped merchandise. Through his spyglass, he studied the impossible meeting between the legendary Apache war chief and the young, unknown rancher, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Below, Silas was drawing a map in the dirt with a stick, marking locations as Takakota described the hidden camp. The boy's memory was remarkably, chillingly detailed. He pointed out guard positions, the layout of the makeshift prison, and the times of day when security was lightest. 22 children, Nalish repeated, his voice heavy with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. Apache, Mexican, even some white children, taken from isolated homesteads. The buyers, Takakota added, his small voice filled with a terrible knowledge. They come from all over, east, west, north. They take children far away, where nobody know them. Silas felt a wave of nausea. He pictured families scattered across the territories, searching desperately for their vanished sons and daughters, never knowing their children had been sold like cattle to the highest bidder. "How many guards?" Silas asked, forcing himself to focus. 8 men, Takakota said. "They stay at camp always. More come when buyers arrive." The Apache leader studied the crude map, his mind already working through the tactical possibilities. 8 men. We can overwhelm them with warriors. "No," Silas said quickly, the word sharp. "If Apache warriors attack the camp head-on, they'll kill the children before they'd ever surrender. They'll use them as shields. We need a different approach." Nalish's eyes narrowed. "What do you suggest, white man?" "I go in first," Silas said, the plan solidifying in his mind. "Alone. I scout the actual layout, confirm the number of children, confirm the number of guards. Then, we coordinate a rescue that saves lives instead of ending them." "It is too dangerous," Nalish said flatly. "You would be walking into their den." "I'm the only one who can," Silas insisted. "Those men know my face now. They think I'm just some dumb rancher who got mixed up in their business by accident. They'll be watching for your warriors, not for me." It was a reasonable plan, born of desperation, but Nalish clearly didn't like the idea of putting his people's fate, and the fate of his only son's mission, into the hands of a settler he barely knew, and had every reason to distrust. But then Takakota spoke up again, his voice firm. "Father, Silas speaks the truth. The guards. They know white men come to the camp. They come to buy children." The idea made Silas's skin crawl, but he knew in an instant that it was brilliant. He could pose as a potential customer, a buyer. He could walk right into the camp and get all the information they needed. "And if they discover your deception?" Nalish asked, his voice grim. "Then I'm dead," Silas said, meeting the chief's gaze without blinking. "And you'll know not to trust any more white men." On the distant ridge, the watcher had seen and heard enough. He carefully packed away his spyglass, mounted his horse, and began riding hard toward the hidden camp, with news that would change everything. The rescue mission was about to become a trap. Back at the meeting site, Nalish was organizing his warriors for the operation. But as they planned, their faces intent and focused, none of them noticed the faint dust cloud rising in the far distance. A cloud kicked up by a single rider, pushing his horse to its absolute limits. "We move at dawn," Nalish decided, his voice resonating with command. "Silas, you will enter the camp as planned. If you succeed in scouting the location, give us a signal. We will strike at sunset, when the fading light favors our approach." "And if I don't succeed?" Silas asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Then we attack anyway," Nalish replied, his face like carved stone. "And we hope the spirits are with the children." It wasn't much of a backup plan, but it was better than leaving 22 kids in the hands of slave traders. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the land, Silas prepared for what might very well be his last night alive. He'd gone from accidentally shooting an Apache boy in the gray light of dawn to planning a joint rescue operation with the boy's formidable father. It was a turn of events he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. But 20 miles away, in a dark, smoky canyon, a man named Garrett Wells was reading a hastily scrawled message delivered by a frantic scout. A cold, cruel smile spread across his face. The escaped boy had not only been found, but he had led them straight to a war party. And now, Wells had leverage he'd never expected. At dawn, Silas rode alone toward the hidden camp, a heavy bag of silver coins in his saddlebags and a well-rehearsed story in his mind. He was a wealthy rancher, looking to buy young, cheap workers for his expanding operation. It was a common enough practice in the lawless territories, though it usually involved adults, not children. The camp was nestled in a narrow canyon, hidden from casual view but easily defended from a frontal assault. As Silas approached the entrance, two guards materialized from the shadows of the rocks, their rifles already leveled at his chest. "State your business," one of them demanded, his voice flat and hostile. "Heard you boys might have some young workers for sale," Silas said, forcing a casual tone, trying to keep his voice steady. "Name's Ward. I run cattle south of here." The guards exchanged a long, meaningful glance. One of them disappeared back into the camp, while the other kept his rifle trained on Silas. Minutes later, a thin man with cold, dead eyes emerged from the canyon. It was Garrett Wells himself. "Mr. Ward," Wells said, a smile on his face that never reached his eyes. "Funny thing. Had some of my men tell me about you just yesterday. Said you were real. Interested in our merchandise." Silas's blood ran cold. They knew. Somehow they knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. The entire plan had been a lie. "Not sure what you mean," Silas said, playing dumb, buying time. "Oh, I think you do," Wells chuckled. He signaled to his men, who moved in, raising their weapons. The trap was closing. "See, we've been missing a valuable piece of property, an Apache boy, about 12 years old. My men tracked him right to your ranch." Silas forced himself to remain calm, to not show the panic that was clawing at his insides. "Can't say I know anything about that." "Really?" Wells said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. He pulled a familiar, crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was the bill of sale, Takakota's bill of sale. "Found this in your saddlebags when my men borrowed them for a moment." Silas's heart sank. They'd searched his belongings while he was distracted by the guards. But how did they get the paper? He had given it back to Takakota, who had given it to his father. Unless it wasn't the original. "Of course, we also found these," Wells continued, producing the heavy silver coins Silas had brought to make his disguise convincing. "Real generous of you to bring payment for the boy's safe return." "Where are the children?" Silas asked, abandoning all pretense. "Safe and sound." Wells gestured vaguely toward the back of the canyon. "For now, 22 of them anyway. The one you stole, he's going to cost you extra." 22. Takakota was safe with his father, but 22 others were still here, still trapped, children who'd been torn from their families, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. "What do you want?" Silas asked, his voice low and tight. "A simple trade," Wells said, his eyes glittering with malice. "You, for them. See, it turns out you're worth a whole lot more to me than all those kids combined." "I don't understand." Wells laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Your new Apache friends are real fond of you, from what my scout reports. Willing to risk their lives, their warriors, to help you rescue these children. That kind of loyalty, Mr. Ward, that makes you very, very valuable." The horrifying truth hit Silas like a physical blow. Wells wasn't just catching him. He was using him as bait to draw Nailish and his warriors into a perfectly prepared trap. The Apache would come to rescue him, to save the children, and they would walk straight into an ambush that would devastate their people for a generation. "They won't come," Silas said desperately, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Oh, they will," Wells said with absolute certainty. "Because that Apache boy of yours is going to tell his daddy exactly where you are. And the Apache. They don't leave debts unpaid." Wells was right. Nailish would honor his agreement. He would come. And he would be leading his people to their slaughter. As the guards tied his hands behind his back, Silas caught a glimpse of the children's prison. It was a makeshift corral, surrounded by high, rough-hewn wooden walls. Small, terrified faces peered through the gaps in the planks, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. But the rescue that was coming would save no one. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and blood red, Silas sat bound in the center of the camp. He was positioned perfectly, exactly where Nailish would see him when the Apache warriors made their approach. Wells had brought in reinforcements. There were at least 15 men now, positioned strategically on the canyon rims and hidden behind boulders, more than double the number Takakota had reported. They had turned the rescue mission into a planned massacre. But Garrett Wells, for all his cruel cunning, had made one crucial, fatal mistake. He assumed that Apache warriors would charge in recklessly, blinded by honor, to save their new white ally. The first sign that his assumption was deadly wrong came as the shadows began to lengthen across the canyon floor. Instead of war cries and the thunder of hooves, there was only a deep, unnatural silence. "Where are they?" one of the guards whispered nervously, his eyes darting around the darkening landscape. Wells checked his pocket watch, a frown creasing his thin face. "They'll come," he insisted, more to himself than to his men. "Apache honor demands it." But Nailish had spent 30 years surviving the brutal conflicts of the frontier. He was a war chief, not a fool, and he didn't charge into obvious traps. The attack, when it finally came, was nothing like Wells had expected. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper. It began with the guards on the canyon rim simply disappearing. No shots fired, no sounds of a struggle. One moment they were there, dark silhouettes against the dying sky, and the next they were gone, swallowed by the shadows. "Morrison! Stevens!" Wells called out toward the ridge, his voice sharp with a rising unease. There was no answer, only the sigh of the wind through the rocks. That's when Silas understood. While Wells and his men had been focused on the main entrance, on the obvious point of attack, Nailish's warriors had scaled the sheer canyon walls under the cover of the growing darkness. They were moving like ghosts, systematically, silently, eliminating the outer guards one by one. Suddenly, a rope dropped from the cliffs above, landing with a soft thud precisely where Silas sat. Before he could even process what was happening, the rope was pulled taut, and in one swift, fluid motion, he was hoisted upward, lifted right out of the center of the camp before Wells or his men could react. "Find them!" Wells screamed, his voice cracking with fury and disbelief. But his remaining men were already under attack. Apache warriors seemed to materialize from every shadow, their assault perfectly coordinated and utterly devastating. But they weren't trying to kill everyone. They had a different objective. They were driving the guards away from the children's corral, herding them toward the mouth of the canyon. Silas, cut free by a grinning Takakota, who had insisted on joining the rescue, ran toward the makeshift prison. The children inside were pressed against the walls in terror, too frightened to understand that they were being saved. "It's all right," Silas called in English, and then repeated it in the few Apache words Takakota had taught him. "You're going home." The corral gate was secured with heavy chains and a thick padlock. As Silas struggled with the locks, his fingers fumbling in the darkness, he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around to see Wells, blood streaming from a deep gash on his head, his face a mask of pure hatred. He had a pistol, and it was trained on Silas's chest. You cost me everything," Wells snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a small stone, thrown with incredible force and accuracy, struck his gun hand. The pistol went flying. Takakota stood 20 feet away, already loading another stone into his simple leather sling, a skill that had no doubt helped him survive his 7 months of captivity. In the next instant, Nailish appeared from the shadows, a silent, avenging spirit, to end Wells's threat permanently. "The children," Silas gasped, turning back to the gate and finally breaking the last chain. What followed was a scene of controlled, beautiful chaos. 22 children, ranging in age from 8 to 15, stumbled out of their prison, blinking in the moonlight. The Apache children ran to the waiting warriors, embracing them with silent, tearful relief. But there were also Mexican and white children who stood alone, lost and confused, with no one to run to. "What happens to them?" Silas asked Nailish, gesturing to the non-Apache children. "They come with us," Nailish said simply, his voice filled with a surprising gentleness. "Until their families can be found, they are our children now." As dawn broke over the quiet canyon, the rescue was complete. Every child was safe and accounted for. The guards were either dead or had scattered to the winds, and the slavers' camp was a smoldering ruin. But the real shock, the real change, came when they returned to the Apache territory. Word of the joint rescue, of the white rancher and the Apache chief working together, had spread like a wildfire across the plains, and something unprecedented, something truly miraculous was happening. White settlers from 3 different ranches had ridden to the edge of the Apache lands. They came not with weapons drawn in fear, but with offers of help. They were families who had lost children to slavers, traders who had heard whispers of the missing kids, all of them drawn by this incredible story, wanting to assist in reuniting the rescued children with their families. "This is not the end," Nailish told Silas as they stood on a ridge, watching the impossible scene below. Apache and settler families working together, sharing food and water, trying to bridge the chasm of 100 years of hatred. "This is how it begins." Silas looked over at Takakota, who was earnestly trying to teach a younger Apache boy a few words of English, while at the same time learning Spanish from a rescued Mexican girl. The young rancher had started his day by accidentally shooting an Apache boy, but what he did next had shocked everyone, including himself. He'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely alliances, forged in blood and desperation, can create the most powerful and lasting change. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen right now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider hitting that super thanks button to help us keep bringing you more stories just like this one. Your support means everything to us.